Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 711, July the 22nd, 1985. I wanted to make just a few comments about Ronald Reagan's illness and then go on with the Simon Wiesenthal story because I believe that is the most important material that I can share with you this week, and then relate some of the current articles in the newspaper back to both the Reagan shooting and to the Simon Wiesenthal biography. You probably watched the news conference when Larry Speaks said that the president's sanity was tested, in quotes, actually tested by the recitation of two poems, both of them having to do with death, the cremation of Sam McGee and the shooting of Dan McGrew. And the nurses actually had books in their hand. The Robert Service poetry book was brought to the hospital to Bethesda, and they followed it line for line, page for page, and he did it flawlessly, and therefore his mind is fine. Heaven help us if this is true. Of course, when he came home, he had the music of the Marine Band, The Saints Come Marching In, and that's a funeral song originating from New Orleans, played at the time of death. I don't think this was purposeful on the Marine Band's part, but certainly a idiotic thing, so that the poems and the music all happen to pertain to death. The Los Angeles Times had a detailed story called An Anatomy of a Cancer. It may have been syndicated in some of your papers, and it may not. But I want to run down a couple of dates with you because I had made the allegations in 1981 that he would be having cancer in 3.5 years. So I think that this report was interesting. March the 3rd, and that's another date that I'm going to bring up again in terms of Joseph Mengele's story. March the 30th is an important date. That's the day Ronald Reagan was shot, and Alexander Haig said, "I'm in charge." That was in 1981 when John Hinckley shot him. In 1982, as I mentioned last week, he went back to the hospital with urinary problems and some difficulty with his kidney, and he had various tests at that time just for the kidney. And this was the first indication that something was wrong with Ronald Reagan's body, at least the first that they were telling us. 1 year or 8 months after the shooting was a sign that part of that body was breaking down. And after that time, there were no more physical tests done for 2.5 years. We thought the president has an examination every year. It was 2.5 years, so that the next date was May 18th, 1984, the first complete physical in 2.5 years where the doctors discovered an inflammatory, what they called a pseudo polyp on the large intestine, and they determined it was benign, and they only removed some of it. They left some of it on and removed part of it and didn't order the colonoscopy, which you know was not given and should have been given along with other tests. And Larry Speaks said then the doctors will decide later if they need to do anything. And the hemocults were done to detect blood in the stool, a sign that cancer may be present in the intestine. That was done in 1984 when that polyp was taken off. And 2 months later, in July, the president's doctor, Dr. Daniel Rouge, R-U-G-E, said that the doctors decided not to conduct any further examination of the president, that he will not have a physical for 2 to 3 years. This is in 1984. They jump every 2 years, so even though he had been shot and had these kidney problems. And he said the growth that took place in May is something you don't have to worry about. And later that assessment of Dr. Rouge became the center of controversy when they discovered that the president had developed cancer. He said, you don't have to think about that at all. We only took out part, and we're not doing further tests. So March the 8th, he began to get tests. He had a physical examination. It was after the inauguration now, 2 months after. And then a second polyp was on the colon, and the doctor said it should be removed. Now, the White House, according to the Los Angeles Times, there's a lot of controversy of who said what at what time. The White House said, put it off until later in June, and they waited until after the Bitburg Cemetery visit. I think that the going to Germany, putting the wreath at the grave sites where the Waffen-SS are buried, helping Helmut Kohl try to get reelected in Germany, was a commitment the president made in November of '84. And I think symbolically, this was important because, as I mentioned last week, this professor in Maryland was working on the skull of Mengele early in the year, about the same time period, February and March, and they were going to bury Josef Mengele, and they were going to resurrect the kindly feelings towards the SS, and he had that commitment, and nothing was going to stand in the way of that. As you noticed, nothing could stand in the way of that. So those tests and everything that were given to him in March of 84 are another large part of this controversy. The first being why they decided to wait a couple of years, 2.5 years, after the one test of the polyp, and the second, why they would have to wait after March to take care of him. That was another part of the controversy. Then the LA Times said, at this point, some specialists suggest that even if the results were not conclusive, they should have followed more aggressively as of March 85, because the test indicated at that time there was blood in the stool. So he waited then, and then through June he said he had the hostage crisis, which had nothing at all to do with whether Ronald Reagan would have surgery or not. The hostage crisis could have come and gone, and he could have done from his hotel room, from his hospital bed, not his hotel room, his hospital bed, or the White House, exactly what he's doing now. He didn't do anything about the hostage crisis except a few words back and forth, and everyone else handled the matter. So that was put off till June, and then July the 12th, when he had an examination, a new polyp was discovered, and then they had to go into the colon and remove 2 feet of the colon, the surgeons at Bethesda, by July the 13th. Now, July 15th, Dr. Rothenberg said the polyp is malignant, and it has spread into layers of the walls of the colon, but he indicated there were no cancer cells at the time. Another report in the newspaper said that when they opened him up, they thought that they would immediately start the chemotherapy, but the disadvantage of having the chemotherapy, the inconvenience to the president, weren't equal. He shouldn't go through that as of the advantages of having it. So that leaves open the question, what did they really see? Now, Dr. Edward Cattau, Cattau at Bethesda, said the first polyp was not the type you would remove, and it may not indicate subsequent growth, but he found that his name was brought up in controversy later because other doctors says the proper procedure, of course, would be to give a barium enema and see if other polyps were present. They took off one, and they only took off half of it, but they didn't follow it up. The standard procedure is the colonoscopy and the barium enema within 6 months, and they started by saying, after the last exam, we'll wait another 2.5 years. Now, Cattau said a lot of thought went into give the test, but it was Reagan's doctors, not him, not Dr. Cattau at Bethesda, but Reagan's doctors that decided against it on the grounds that the cellular characteristic of the first polyp didn't indicate cancer. So he put it back into the hands of the other doctors. Now, Dr. Rosenberg endorsed this Dr. Cattau at Bethesda's plan in May of 84, based on the fact that he didn't seem to appear a cancer risk and that annual examinations would take care of that. But in March 85, when the hemocolt test indicated that there was blood in the stool, the doctors recommended the colonoscopy, and then the tests were delayed. And that's where the doctors waited 2.5 years, and said, well, we better do it now. Here's blood. Then the other doctors, away from Bethesda, delayed it because they said it was the president's schedule. Many of you know people who've had cancer, or members of your family, and usually from the time you get the diagnosis, you make arrangements and get into the hospital as fast as you can. Larry Speaks says it is correct to say there was no recommendation for further testing in 1984. Nothing at all. And another criticism is the urgency with which the medical team recommended it. The Bethesda naval doctors detected the presence of a second polyp, but they made no recommendation of urgency. But another person got into the act, a Captain Carney, the internist who coordinated the physical exam, And he said Dr. Cateau strongly urged in March of 84 a colonoscopy be done as soon as possible. So going back and forth, what did Bethesda say? What did Reagan's advisors say? I think Ronald Reagan wanted to win the election and didn't care, and he was committed to Helmut Kohl, and he put that off. And the urgency never, if it had dawned on him, it probably wasn't pressed, because one doctor, Cateau, strongly urged it in March of 84 as soon as possible, and Bethesda has been criticized for putting it off. But Captain Carney said they were criticized unfairly when the test wasn't done in 1984, but that it's the White House doctors who have the final authority for what is done, and he should set the record straight. Why they why they didn't agree on a colonoscopy was not needed then. He doesn't understand it. So the urgency issue in March 85 should have been pressed, and he should have taken care of it right then. The problem of more tests in 84 should have been called to attention, and hemoccult tests certainly in March 85 demanded immediate attention, not into July, and some people believe he only decided to do it because his brother had cancer. Another issue that was brought up is the hemoccult test given in 84 seemed to be negative with blood in the stool, but by March 85, the two tests were positive. Now, the White House doctors say they gave two tests that were positive and two were negative, but the authorities say that that doesn't mean anything, because often you can have both. You can have polyps that bleed, and then they stop bleeding. So if you have any sign of the bleeding, you do the barium enema and the colonoscopy. You do both of them at that point, and that triggers further investigation on why they would say, I did it now and it shows it, and I do it a week later and it doesn't. It's characteristic that it may not show up. And so these issues and the squabbling was done, recorded in the Los Angeles Times this past week. And I think the whole story, of course, is gross, and it's pretty obvious to everyone around the country, or most people who think about it, not obvious to those who don't think about it, that a lot of questions that should be answered never will, but they're being posed at least. Some people resent the news media bringing them out in the open. They want to accept the fact that he has this cancer, he was cured, he's fine, you have no right to discuss it, and it shakes too many people to think of the possibilities. Now, I want to mention just one news story about Agca, Mehmet Ali Agca, who hasn't been on the stand testifying this past week, but some very important information came out in the New York Times just opening up this trial again regarding the contacts of Agca with various people dealing drugs and selling weapons that are linked in some way or tied to the assassination plot on the Pope. And again, these dates are very important. This story, one that I have that I want to refer to in detail probably next week, is called Turk in Rome Case Details Smuggling. And this is Bekir Celenk, C-E-L-E-N-K, who allegedly had given money to Agca to shoot the Pope. He said he didn't. But he is telling in the courts, this is July the 17th, New York Times story, he's telling the court about the drug traffic and the weapons from Czechoslovakia and West Germany and the Middle East and the heroin, and going to Turkey and Lebanon and into the Swiss banks and into money and funds of Syrian dealers, because Mr. Arsan, A-R-S-A-N, tied to STIBAM, S-T-I-P-A-M, that is the Banco Ambrosiano P2 Masonic Lodge fascist Nazi apparatus that was exposed just the same week that the Pope was shot in May of 1981. That story broke open. Agca is linked to STIBAM, S-T-I-P-A-M, and the drug center in Milan. And the important thing is that at the time that the Pope was selected to be killed, the people working out of the Swiss banks and in Syria could very easily and are linked to, down to LICIO GELLI, to Klaus, Barbie, and Josef Mengle, and Stefano Delle Chiaie, and Mr. Tuma from Syria, the chief of police from Sao Paulo, Brazil. I'm convinced that he is part of the STIBAM operation. So the drug and arms dealer, Mr. Celenk, is talking in the courts of Italy in Rome, and all of a sudden, for most purposes, there's been a blackout this past week, at least maybe in the European press, but in the papers that I read this past week. But the whole circle of events, from the assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan in March and the assassination attempt to the Pope in 1981, the two of them, in May 81, may have an awful lot to do with their knowledge and participation with people involved in international drug traffic, such as LICIO GELLI being at Reagan's inauguration and working with Michael Ledeen and Alexander Haig. The web of the shooting of the two men, to the narcotics traffic, and to the top Nazis in South America that were later brought in after Reagan and the Pope were shot. Klaus Barbie was brought to France. Mengele has been officially buried. There's a whole network that I will draw and diagram for you, because it's hard to comprehend it as each individual article comes along. Now, in 1979 was the investigation that the judge started to make into the P2 in Italy, into this international connection of STIBAM that turned out to be the links to Hollywood, to Colonial Dignidad, to Ronald Reagan, the Republicans, the international drug traffic, Carlo Palermo, the judge in Italy, Trento, Italy. March 1982 began a series of arrests that broke the story of the links of Banco Ambrosiano, Roberta Calvi, LICIO GELLI, and it also goes into Israel. These stories of STIBAM and the arrests in Italy go to Israel and their role with receiving oil with the Dutch government, Royal Dutch Shell, Prince Bernhard as the intermediary when they needed oil during the hostage crisis. The last time Israel would send guns and weapons to Khomeini, who was in power. And the network of people associated with each other, such as Royal Dutch Shell and Simon Wiesenthal, Israel and drug traffic, Israel and the need for oil, explains a lot of reasons why so many people are silent and willing to put Mengele to rest. The Israeli government this week said they still believe he's alive, but there are a lot of people like Simon Wiesenthal and hundreds of others that are willing to bury him. Now, the investigations into STIBAM, which have their connections to Syria, and Romeo Tumo, as I say, the police chief and head of the death squad and the terror gang down in Brazil, his family are from Syria. He's a Syrian, a devout Catholic. Those investigations began in 1979. In 1979 is when the CIA had memos that Josef Mengele was heavily involved in cocaine traffic and that Hans Sedlmayr was the money man with the Mengele factories in South America. It was in February of 79 when Josef Mengele would officially be buried, so if they needed to resurrect him later, Mr. Tumo and the police and the Americans and the Bonn German government could say that Mengele was buried. It was in 1979 that Agca, a far-right member of the Grey Wolves fascist organization drug dealer, killed the editor in Turkey, Abdi Iraki, I-R-E-K-C-I, I don't know if I pronounce it right. Agca murdered him in 1979 and then was sprung out of the jail. In 1979, the Shah of Iran was still in power, and Iran was running a heavy dope operation, of course, in the Shah's family and the French connection that our banks depended upon, and money from dope and oil, of course, could go into banks like Chase Manhattan, the Boston Bank, the Continental Illinois, and so forth. In 1979, Khomeini was in Paris, and the Shah was in Iran with the dope. The Soviet Union had not absorbed Afghanistan, which was an important part of the Western German-American drug money coming in, and India didn't have their separatist insurgency where the Sikhs would go into heroin growing and work with the Central Intelligence Agency. And after that interruption, after 79, when the arrests and investigations began to break down in STIBAM, all of a sudden Khomeini's in power in Iran, and that dope money's cut off from our government, our CIA, and the bankers. The Afghanistan drug market is cut off, And the CIA heroin, the separatist movement, was built up to help with this triangle, the Golden Triangle, to keep the narcotics traffic going, as the Western world and the bankers and Swiss bankers lost the money from Iran and Afghanistan. They were pushing the heroin into India, into the Sikh movement, in return for promising the separatism. So 1979 is an important year, and it does link to operations not only in Syria, but I'll be doing more with you on STIBAM International and how they worked with Israel. And British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell were sending money, oil, to Israel so they could function. They need oil. In return, Israel was giving Khomeini weapons. But Simon Wiesenthal is a close attachment, of course, to Israel, and a common denominator between him and the funding of Israel through this whole operation, the banks and oil, is again Royal Dutch Shell and Prince Bernhard, one who founded and helped the Wiesenthal Center going until 1979, till it built its own momentum, and it plays a part in supplying the oil for Israel, so that the Shah, when the Shah was out, Khomeini could get the guns to fight Iraq. Now, I'm going, one other thing before I go into Simon Wiesenthal's story is, I mentioned last week the arrest of Mr. Roeder, Manfred Roeder, in Germany, the terrorist, again, who links to all of these international drug traffic patterns of the fascists, the Nazis, and the international network of guns and weapons, a right-wing passage, bringing in narcotics to pay for the guns and shipping guns to these various countries. Now, Manfred Roeder had a diary that was retrieved in Germany after he was arrested that gave the names of the interconnecting web of network of guns and drug traffic. He was arrested in 1980, September 1980, but in March the 30th, Manfred Roeder is the fellow whose diary with the connecting links was located of Mr. Zundel up in Canada, who gave him supplied the Nazi literature, the links of Zundel to the Institute of Historical Review and Willie Carto and that Nazi network. Now, the day that this story broke about the connections of Roeder from Canada to Los Angeles and around the world, literally around the world, with the guns and arming the Nazis and producing the Nazi literature. And this, of course, goes down to South America. And in 1985, it was Manfred Roeder who got a letter in his cell beginning to break the story about Joseph Mengele being dead. Well, March the 30th was the day that his diary of these connections that would go back or around STIBAM and Banco Ambrosiano and LICIO GELLI. Those people connect in their web of I call the Odessa network. But the day that they printed the information about Roeder's diary and his connecting links was the day that Ronald Reagan was shot, and Alexander Haig, who had worked closely with LICIO GELLI, as I say, and Michael Ledeen, and the entire network from Italy to Argentina, the Nazis throughout the world, when Haig said he was in charge, was the day Reagan was shot, was just simultaneous with the day that the diary of the connecting links of Roeder, Manfred Roeder, and again that goes up to his close association with Richard Butler and the Aryan nations, and Butler's working at Lockheed at the time of the U-2 flights and working with Thane Caesar, who was the actual person who murdered Robert Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan was on the Rockefeller Committee, allegedly, and of course not looking into the murder of John Kennedy. All of these interconnecting personalities that bump each other have days that overlap. So 1979 was a very important year, and of course Roeder reaches all of these because the day that his network is revealed is the same day that Ronald Reagan is shot. And as I say, in 1985, he conveniently gets a letter in his cell just about March telling him Uncle is dead, he drowned. And that's the excuse to go down to the beach in Sao Paulo, one of the excuses so that they could officially bury Joseph Mengele. They had from 1979 to 1985. If there was never anyone on his trail, it wouldn't matter. They'd leave him there. but within those 6 years, the body could rot sufficiently to have trouble recognizing it if they waited that long. So Roeder's name comes up linking to this international web of Nazis and to Permindex operation through the Klan and Nazi connections to John Connolly and to Richard Butler. So the day that his network is revealed, and I'll do more on that later on Manfred Roeder, is the day that Ronald Reagan is shot in Washington, D.C., and I don't think it's coincidental that Haig is up there. He wanted to be in charge of the White House when Richard Nixon was taken away and Watergated. It was Alexander Haig who brought in Alex Butterfield from the military intelligence that he worked with. They worked together earlier to begin taping Richard Nixon in the White House, and it was those tapes that got him out of office. Haig is linked to a planned coup by LICIO GELLI in Italy to overthrow that democracy. He has relationships to people from the Bay of Pigs and those agents involved in murdering Kennedy. He had a big part in getting Richard Nixon out of office, and of course he grabbed the rostrum to take over when Ronald Reagan was shot. And Nixon and Reagan and this whole group are linked to the drug traffic, to the Nazis who escaped, to the international bankers who profit from the drugs, and to the Nazi network that was protected after the war and then got together as soon as possible when people began to relax and get themselves into the activities of what we know as the Cold War. Now, I'm going to rush through some years. I've done a lot on this matter. I'm going back to the chronology of these people later. I want to get right to Simon Wiesenthal and do as much as I can on the favors that were done for him, probably this week and next week, put a lot of the news aside, and just describe Simon Wiesenthal and ask some questions when I get through this chronology, the dates of his activities during the war and, of course, after the war. Now, one of the most valuable books that I have, along with other researchers, is that one by Mr. Rees, Kurt Rees, called The Nazis Go Underground. It was published in 1944, and I absolutely believe, based upon the things I read, and I'm taking most of this from Simon Wiesenthal's book and an interview in the Washington Post so that I don't slant it with opinions outside about Wiesenthal. I'm taking it from his own book, written by a member of the OSS who was in the OSS when Wiesenthal was, and also his own interviews in Saga magazine and in the Washington Post, and asking you about him. I'm convinced that Wiesenthal's role, and it's outrageous to say this, but you think about it now, and we'll get back to it later, that his role as early as 1944, maybe the end of 43, seems indicated in 43, he already was going to have the role as the, in quotes, Nazi hunter, and the top Nazis and a lot of the Waffen-SS that he worked with through the war, through the last 2 years or through the entire war, they seemed to be aware that he would be the historian or the record keeper of the crimes that certain guards did and the tortures, and they knew to be on his side. Now, that's an interesting concept because he studied as an architect for 3 or 4 years, and then he was painting signs, swastikas, and we love you, Adolf Hitler on the trains taking people to the concentration camps and in celebration of Hitler's birthday and so forth. He was an artist. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't an investigator. But the Nazis, on several occasions, they seem to indicate that he will be in charge of who gets punished and who doesn't. And maybe this explains why he never looked for Otto von Bolschwing or the Iron Guard that came to this country, Mr. Triffia, or Nikolai Malaksa, or Werner von Braun, or the crimes of Mr. Dornberger and the NASA scientists, or Reinhard Gehlen coming here. The hunks of people that he ignored are just tremendous, or looking for Martin Bormann or Joseph Mengele, passing over the whole Odessa network of Karl Wolff and Hans Ulrich Rudel and the mobility they had in and out of Germany while he was living there, or in Vienna where he lives. This, reading the chronology of him during the war, gives a pretty good idea of Simon Wiesenthal, not only in 1985, 2 days after the Mengele bones, if it's Mengele, that skull is dug up, that he's more convinced the second day than the first with less reason and none at all, as a matter of fact. And it also explains how deep and insidious the role was to rebuild the Nazis, to pass them over, let certain people take the rap. That's what happened. They selected certain guards or certain inmates and members of the Waffen-SS who were his friends. He was with them through this entire war period. Seemed to know where his wife was, how to find her. Saw his mother go into the ovens, but he survived. He's a survivor. I'm going to begin now on the second half on the chronology of Simon Wiesenthal, and next week do at least another half hour to complete it. But I want to go into Wiesenthal. How deep does his commitment go to those Germans to protect them in return for bringing a few of the little fish in? We'll begin that now and start with Simon Wiesenthal as a possible collaborator. That question was asked in a long article by Lyndon LaRoche, who discovered Fritz Kramer, for me and for nobody else. He does ask questions. He had a long story on Simon Wiesenthal, accused him of being a collaborator. I think I can say the same thing, not paraphrasing Lyndon LaRoche, and I'm not a LaRoche or a Mooney or anything else. It seems that he obviously was. We'll begin that right now on the second part of this broadcast. This is Mae Brussell. This is part 2 of broadcast number 711, World Watchers, July the 22nd, 1985. I'm going to be quoting, for the most part, from Wiesenthal's own book, The Murderers Among Us. It was published in 1967, and as I say, it indicates his special treatment by the SS, his friendship with Nazis and in the SS, not the O. That came in 1945, and most of this material will be from that book of his. I listed the favors that he got from top Nazis and his friends, and I'll put some of those names on the printed sheet that accompanies this broadcast. You will get it if you subscribe to the tape, and you can send a self-addressed stamped envelope to me, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93922, if you want further information or to see these names written down so you can study them. In the book, The Murders Among Us, the author said that Wiesenthal was saved from a series of near miracles. He referred to them as near miracles as he survived more than 12 concentration camps. We won't get through 12 in this half hour, but we'll do as many as we can. And they were everywhere from Poland to Austria, and most of his relatives, including his mother, was exterminated. Now, his background was such that he had reason to have no great love affair for the Russians or the Germans, of course, and yet when the war is over, or as it's winding down, he's fleeing with the SS to Germany. Just a brief background of where he was located in the cities so that you understand the political position he was in or where his mindset was. He was brought up in a town called Busicz, B-U-C-Z-I-C-Z, in Poland. His father was in the Austrian army. He was killed in the war in 1915. The town began to be taken over by the Tsar's army. Before the revolution, they had moved in, and the Cossacks moved in. And into this town of Busicz were a lot of frightened Jews. The Cossacks were the Tsar's horsemen who would come into town. They had small, fast horses, and they'd plow down and have what they called were pogroms, P-O-G-R-O-M-S, where they would tear into town, beat up the Jews, destroy their stores, kill them, sometimes slice them open. And many of you saw the play Fiddler on the Roof at the time of the wedding when the Cossacks come and there's a pogrom. Well, that's the kind of town that Simon Wiesenthal grew up in, that was sometimes taken over by the Tsar's Cossacks. Now, Jack Ruby, in 1964, told members of the Warren Commission, including Gerald Ford and Earl Warren, that because of what he did and the people who used him, and he was referring to the John Birch Society and H.L. Hunt and that gang, that we would have pogroms in this country, similar to what the Cossacks and the Tsars had in Russia, where his family came from. Interestingly enough, H.L. Hunt and Clint Murchison were setting up death squads for America, death squads, and began to work with the Minutemen, had used the Minutemen in the role of killing John Kennedy, particularly, and Martin Luther King, working with the Nazis. And today, Reverend Gale, as part of the identity movement and part of the survivalists and the preacher for these movements, Richard Butler up in Idaho, the friend of Manfred Roeder, in jail in Germany, leaking the Mengele story. They have tape cassettes on the air on how to kill Jews today and how to cut their throats. Those traditions were brought over from the Cossacks, and so Wiesenthal lived in an area with no love for the Russians as the Russians, and then many of the people left his home and went to Galicia in Germany and then back to the hometown. At the end of the war in 1915, the armistice came. His mother and brother went back to their hometown. They moved first to Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg monarchy. He went to school there and lived in Galicia. And in 1917, after the revolution, the Russians retreated from Galicia, where he was living, and the Jews returned there. So he was living there happily, I guess, in his hometown. The Russian Revolution had taken place. Now, all of a sudden, this Western Ukrainian Republic becomes violent again. And this is the time period in 1920 where the Polish were fighting the Bolsheviks because Herbert Hoover was taking the money from Congress. He had wanted $55 million plus more that he put into Vaslov's army, which was the White Russians. So the Poles were becoming armed to fight the Russians who had had the revolution. So he was living in the middle of his own country, fighting with the Vaslov's army, the White Tsarists, opposing the new revolution in Russia. So from this period on, there were unending wars that were really the precursor of World War II, and we'll begin our World War III also, where the Poles armed are fighting the Russians trying to stop the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks moved into his hometown various times and pulled in the bourgeois, asked them to put up money for them. They turned their gymnastic hall into stables for the horses. And then the Ukrainian cavalry opposed, and that was made up of the former Cossacks who had the pogroms. So the Ukrainians were the right Russian czarists who tore into town with pogroms, who Wiesenthal then sides with that element of the Ukrainian, and not they're the former Cossacks who were killing and cutting up the Jews, raping, plundering, and murdering. And they became part of Mr. Bandera's army. And in the book, The Belarus Secret, by John Loftus, you get a picture of this scene. Out of the Ukrainian group came people like Lev Dobryansky, a cabinet position as ambassador to Bahamas under Ronald Reagan. His daughter, Paula Dobryansky, is in the National Security Council. Wiesenthal became friendly to the former Cossacks who were the pogrom people that gave the pogrom, and sided with the Germans and the Ukrainians against the Russians. When he has a choice later, he does that. Now, these were the people that burned down the Jewish homes and cut them up, and did all those various things. Now, he moved away to the mountains, the Carpathian Mountains, in 1925. His mother remarried, and then her husband was sent during the war. He was sent to Siberia, to a prison camp where he was killed. Now, evidently, the family was against the Bolsheviks, so as they came over, Wiesenthal's family were considered on the enemy list. His stepfather was sent away. In 1936, he married a woman named Syla, C-Y-L-A, Syla Mueller. He'd gone to Prague and studied. He lived in Czechoslovakia and studied architecture. In 1936, he got married and opened an architectural office in 1936. In 1939, the Germans and the Russians had a non-aggression pact where they both agreed they would partition Poland. And Simon Wiesenthal, of course, was living in Poland. So the Germans invaded in September 1939, September the 1st, their blitzkrieg into Poland from the west side, and the Russians went into Poland from the east. Again, just putting the mindset of Wiesenthal of where he was choosing, say, the Russians from one side and the Germans from the other. And he lived in a town called Lwow, L-W-O-W. And in middle of September, of 1939, the Russians went into Laos, and Wiesenthal was, in quotes, liberated by the Germans at that time. But then the Russian security came, the NKVD, and arrested many of the Jews. As I say, took his stepfather to Siberia where he died. Took his stepbrother, was arrested and shot in 1941. Now, he loses his stepfather and his stepbrother to the Russians. He loses his mother and all of his family to the Nazi ovens and extermination camps, but he sides with the Germans, even though they did millions and millions of murders because of Jews. He was Jewish, but he survives very well as a Jew, and the SS, Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, are kindly towards him. Now, I started listing the favors of Simon Wiesenthal. There's over 25 different favors that he got from the time he was out of architectural school until he begins to build these multi-million-dollar buildings in the United States. 30 million just passed last week. The goal is 100 million for his institute in Washington, and he has a goal of 20 million in Beverly Hills. So we have a long route between here and Roxbury Drive in Beverly Hills or Washington. But the very first paper began that when the Russians were in town, they had passport number 11 for certain people. This is before the Nazis arrived, that Jews became subhuman, not subhuman like the Nazis, but underprivileged, second-class citizens. They couldn't live in larger cities. They couldn't live near certain borders. They couldn't have bank accounts. They couldn't have certain jobs. But Wiesenthal was able, according to him, he bribed, but the Russians were nice enough, the NKVD, he got what you call a regular passport, starting different than any other Jew. So this is, even when the Russians are there, he has some charisma or whatever it is, he gets a special passport, 3, one for himself, one for his wife, and one for his mother. So a few months later, all the Jews who had this other passport were deported to Siberia in this particular town, and most of them died. They weren't trusted by the Russians, and evidently they were siding with the Cossacks and Ukrainians that moved into their area. But he managed to stay alive and worked in town in Laos, and his mother and wife were there. The other Jews were deported. So that was the first favor, special passports, 3 of them, and the others were deported. Now, June 22nd, 1941, this is 22 months after the non-aggression pact, Germany begins to invade Russia. They had a hold off to each take half of Poland, but Germany is going to go for Russia as of June 22nd, 1941. And June the 30th, 1941, the town of Lwow, Lwow, Poland, where Wiesenthal lives with his wife and mother, is invaded by the Germans, and the Russians retreat 8 days later. The Germans invaded, and the first German uniforms are on the street. The Ukrainian troops had been taken out of their area when they fled the Soviet Union, when the Bolsheviks came in. They went to Germany, and they were trained by the German army during this period of rearmament of Germany, and they celebrated Laos with a traditional pogrom. What they used to do as Cossacks working for the Tsar, they were sent to Western Europe, trained by the German army, so they came in and pulled again one of these pogroms where over 6,000 Jews were killed in 3 days. Some of the remaining Jews of his hometown had been murdered within 3 days. Now keep in mind that Wiesenthal is going to be friendly with these people. These are the people he's going to side with through the war, and particularly as the war is winding down, they're the ones that do him favors. So the second favor he receives, the first is to get special working papers to stay in town that he and his wife and mother have. For what other reason? A regular passport. And the next favor is that the pogrom comes and the Jews are wiped out, but his family isn't touched. He's all right and survives the mass killings and goes on to greater territory with a few hardships, I admit. Now, July the 6th, 1941, Simon Wiesenthal is hiding in the cellar of a house. He's playing chess with a friend of his. He only uses the last names in his book. Everything is in last name. There's very few first names, which is interesting. He doesn't give them that. He plays with a man named Gross, At 4 o'clock, the Ukrainians come and arrest him. Those are the Ukrainians trained in Germany, the German troops that have invaded Poland, and a lot of them came from his hometown, and one of the men spoke Yiddish with him, and he was taken to Brigida prison. That's his first prison, Brigidka prison, and 40 lawyers and doctors and teachers and engineers in the courtyard of the prison. And the Jews are forming a line against a wall in a long row in the prison. This is page 26. All of this is out of his book, and I'll tell you when it's from the Washington Post. But this chronology, I prefer to use his own book. He's facing a wall, and they're told to cross their arms and put their hands behind their neck. And there's an empty crate next to each person. A person, a crate, a person in crate, 40 of them. In the center of the area, the courtyard, is a large table with vodka bottles and sausage and guns and ammunition. And the Ukrainians would shoot each man in the neck as they went down the line. And then 2 Ukrainians would pick them up and throw the bodies in the crates. And there was shouting and crying. And they get close to Wiesenthal, and suddenly the Ukrainian voice says, "Enough, enough, we've got to go to evening mass," and the shooting stops, so Wiesenthal is protected. Now, this happens quite a few times to him. The sky falls, the lightning comes, or whatever. He says there were 20 Jews left, and they went down to the floor, slept on the floor of the prison, and he wakes up, and a man says, "Mr. Wiesenthal, what are you doing here?" And the man was Mr. Bodnar, a former construction person he knew, Bodnar. He had an armband of the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police and also a civilian suit. He said, "I've got to get you out of here tonight." So he arranged that Wiesenthal and Gross could escape. And so that is the third favor. It actually is the one where they're not shot in the firing squad, but then somebody comes and he's allowed to escape, an old buddy. And I don't believe when the Germans went into town, the accounts of what they did in that town, I'll read later, but I'm just talking about Simon Wiesenthal now, that Wiesenthal and Gross were able to escape. He said, "I'll tell them that you're Russian spies, and I'll beat you up a little, and then you run on home." He did lose 2 teeth. They knocked him up a little, and he ran home to his wife and mother. Now, the Germans have occupied that town in Lau, August 1941, and they made a statement and order. All Jews must move to the ghetto, give up their apartments. An SS man comes to his apartment where Wiesenthal and his wife live, and an hour later, Wiesenthal is out, and then he's taken to Janowski prison. This is his second prison in the town of Lau, at the Janowska. Now, Simon Wiesenthal and his wife, Sila, are sent from Janowski concentration camp to a forced labor camp. This is their third settlement. And this camp is served by the Eastern Railroad, the Ostbahn Repair Works Eastern Railroad. And the Germans are planning an offensive into the Soviet Union, so this railroad is important for the supplies, the supply line. It's kept open. And if you've ever seen a map of Poland with the concentration camps throughout Poland, this was very important. Now, Wiesenthal's wife worked in the locomotive workshop. She polished brass, and as I mentioned last week, he painted swastikas and eagle shields on Russian locomotives that were captured, and he became the head sign painter. He was promoted to that. Now, he meets another pal, a man who likes him, where he's painting his swastikas. His name is Heinrich Gunthard, Guenthert. And he says, your hands are cold, they're blue, you shouldn't paint outside. So the next favor is that Gunthard moves him inside, promotes his job, and he asked Wiesenthal what his education was, because the educated are being shipped off as the bourgeoisie, and he lies, and his friend at the camp there who hires him says, well, you can survive. And the next favor is that he is allowed to survive. Intelligent Jews were given the priority to be exterminated, according to Wiesenthal. They didn't want these people that are too smart around, but they said, you can stay here. And he stayed the equivalent of, he acted as if he'd gone to trade school. They knew he was different, but he impressed them, and they were impressed with him. So he became a technician and a draftsman, at the railroad yard, the Ostbahn, where all the people being shipped to the concentration camps, the animal herds being packed into cars, OSTBHN Repair Works, Eastern Railroad. He stayed there as a technician and draftsman, and is even there when his mother is put on the train that goes off to the concentration camps. It's similar to that Mr. Berkowitz that worked for Joseph Mengele. And he said you can have a pass that day. He sees his mother going off to the ovens. He lets him have the day off to see Mom go off to the ovens, and then goes back to Mengele to be his valet. Well, Wiesenthal is at the train works, working there and painting his swastikas. And then it jumps, this story jumps to favor number 5 or 6, whichever way you want to list it. He says the living conditions were bearable there. And at this time period, he goes into 1942. Now, it's later into the war. January the 20th, 1942, there is the Wannsee Conference, WANNSEE Conference, where Reinhard Heydrich meets with 15 top Nazis, including Adolf Eichmann, who proposes they get together what is the final solution of the Jewish problem, to deport to the east and forced labor, the mass executions, the mass murders. Adolf Eichmann was in charge of that, the Jewish problem, and of course the railroads were very important to that matter. Now, when Heydrich was murdered in May of 1942, 4 months later, the Gestapo ordered out of Prague and Czechoslovakia a wave of terror of Jews surviving in Europe. But it didn't bother Simon Wiesenthal or his wife. He continued where he was going. And in August of 1942, this was after the final solution, after Heydrich was killed, thousands of Jews were sent from Weil Railroad to their death camp. This is page 28 of his own book. The camps were now set up in Poland, and Wiesenthal watched and looked on helplessly while he had his job at the railroad yard. Now, he may have been helpless and he may have been a survivor in 1942, but you don't have to be so kindly to the Waffen-SS. Afterwards, he helplessly, in quotes, had this job, and he knew what was going on. It was right under his eyes. And he says the SS crammed old Jewish women into cars. Some cars were sitting out in the sun for 3 days waiting to get to the camps where they would be exterminated, and they were begging for water and crying. And one of those in this wagon of cars waiting to go was his own mother, his 63-year-old mother. He never saw her again. She died at the Belzec concentration camp, and he worked at the railroad yards. But it gets worse. When he escapes, they give him another job. When he has lists of the top Gestapo and their torturers, they commend him and promote him. It gets worse. We're just barely warming up to Wiesenthal. So his mother gets shot by the Ukrainians, and she dies at the camp. And his mother-in-law died. So the Nazis, as I say, killed his mother and killed his mother-in-law, and the brother-in-law and his wife's, his stepfather, his mother's husband, second husband, are killed in Siberia, but the others are killed by the Germans, and certainly millions then were being killed by the Germans. In September of 1942, most of his family are dead. He thought all the Jews would be killed, but he wanted to save his wife. September of 42. He's going to meet up with her 3 years later. But he had friends in the Polish underground inside the railroad repair works, so he arranged for her to get freedom and leave the job where she's working. He had freedom at work. His account says he could go into town as a technician. He had friends in the town, and he was drawing plans of the railroad junctions for the leaving the town out of Lao, and where the trains would go, where they could be blown up and sabotaged in case when they were going off to the camps where the people would be killed. So he asked a favor and said that he would turn over the drawings of the railroad plans, but maybe the history of Germany and Poland is that the tracks were blown up. I'm not really sure they were, and I don't remember reading that much about the resistance, but he had friends outside the camp, and he smuggled his wife, Sila, to a man named Zielinski, Zielinski, and he got her out of the railroad yards and out of the repair works, and then she was taken to an apartment, and then another person, an architect from a construction firm he knew, concealed her as his sister, and she stayed in a house in Lubin where she took care of the children. But the shocking thing is that when she leaves in 1944, when the war is just about over, and he's near Krakow, Poland, where she is, in 1945, he says he wanted to get to her through the underground. In the position he's in, and we'll go into it in detail later, it would be impossible. How would he know, after traveling in and out of these concentration camps as a Jew, who would possibly be housing her 3 years later? But believe me, the punchline is that she does surface, and she's back with Simon Wiesenthal, and they're happy ever after, and that she lived right in Krakow, Poland, while all the Jews were being exterminated. Massive deportments and intense hatred of the Jews through this area. She's protected, and when she gets a warning the Gestapo is coming where she lived, she got out of the way and returned back to her hometown, and Simon went there to say goodbye to her, and she made a deal with these friends. She'd go to Warsaw and stay with a certain friend, and he would trade the maps. So she's on her way, and as I say, they do meet up later. Now, he stays at the railroad yard, and he describes it on page 29 that it was an island of sanity in a sea of madness. This is in 1942. The late Heydrich orders were kill all the Jews. The trains are pouring in with people from France and Germany and Holland. The railroad yard should certainly be one of the most disgusting and sickening places with the masses of humanity, and he calls the railroad yard an island of sanity in a sea of madness. Can you imagine this being the central point where trains come and go with cattle cars of human beings? And he refers to it as sanity in a sea of madness. Now, he had a friend there, as I say, this Heinrich Gunhard, who took a liking to him, and 50 German officials who he said behaved correctly to the Poles and Jews. They behaved correctly. And he had another friend, Adolf Kohlratz, Kohlrautz, who was Wiesenthal's superior, like Mr. Gunhard, and he described him as a exceptionally decent man. And they were so friendly with him that they gave him 2 pistols to keep in his desk, and Wiesenthal could go in and out of town. This is a Jew working at the railroad yards, the yards where he's seen his mother and hundreds and thousands of others shipped out, and he has his own pistol, and he goes in and out of town, and he has sanity in this town, in this sea of madness. Now, in this particular account of his life, he goes from September 1942, where he's at the railroad yard, and he's at a work camp, where his wife is with him, and she walks away, and he never says they looked for her. They never said that she had a job that she was missing that day. You know, missing Jews, you'd go to the husband and certainly yank his ears and legs or take him to the firing squad. And it seems no one at the railroad yard misses his wife at all. And then at bottom of page 29, it follows right, the 2 pages right, one after the other. It jumps Adolf Hitler's birthday in April 43. And it doesn't tell you anything about what Wiesenthal saw or did October, November, December of 42, January, February, March, April of 43. Now, the Nazis started going underground in this time period from January to April 43. There's 6.5 months that have passed where he has these very good friends. He has his own gun. He can go in and out of the town. He knows where his wife is in Poland because he's going to try and reach her at that place a little later. He's not punished that she walks away, and it's not too important. And on Hitler's birthday, as I said before, he is painting swastikas, happy birthday, Adolf Hitler. It's April the 20th, and they're decorating the camp. And Simon is up at dawn painting the swastikas. And the SS is going to have a celebration at the railroad yard. So Wiesenthal and 2 Jews are painting signs in quotes, "We love our Führer." Okay, now a man named Dyga, D-Y-G-A, from Silesia, took Wiesenthal and the 2 Jews away. They were taken to another concentration camp. This is his 3rd camp, 2 miles away. And the SS guards want to celebrate Hitler's birthday, and they're mad about the defeat in Stalingrad 2 months earlier. So they round up these Jews and take them to the workshop in an area called the hose. And the hose is 6 or 7 feet wide, a corridor, and there's a sand pit at the end, and it's separated from the other installations. And they put a table there, and they're going to shoot everybody at the edge. The hose is synonymous with death. No one who goes to the hose ever comes back alive. It's between 2 corridors of barbed wire fence, he describes on page 31, and they take 20 men and some women, and they're waiting to be killed. And Wiesenthal assumes that he will be killed because among them, again, are professors, teachers, lawyers, and doctors, and a few camp intelligentsia. And the SS is going to shoot them to separate the Fuhrer's birthday, and the SS men appear led by a man named Mr. Kauser, Kauzer, with a submachine gun. And the ditch is 6 feet deep and 1,500 feet long. They take off their clothes. He's naked, and dead bodies are inside, and then sand is filled, and then more Jews are there. Wiesenthal has his clothes off, and the truck drives them. There's 38 men and 6 women on a truck. They go to the hose. They form a single row at the rim of the cockpit, and Kauser takes his machine gun, and he hears the crying and the dying, and then he hears the gun, like Mark Lane hears the guns going off down in Guyana, Jonestown, and they're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. He shoots and kills, and then a voice says, Wiesenthal. Now, this happened before. It's going to happen again. I've got to finish this because we're going to run out of time in a minute. But it happens again. Wiesenthal. He snaps to his attention. He's stark naked. An SS man from the Waffen-SS named Koller, Koller, tells Wiesenthal to follow him. And they go with Mr. Kauser, the executioner. Kauser came to kill 44 people. He pulls Wiesenthal from the group. 43 die. And Wiesenthal is protected. The others are killed. And he's told to get dressed. And he's delivered to Mr. Kohlratz, his boss, at the repair works. And he's put back at the railroad signs, painting, "We love the Fuhrer." And the others are in the ditch. And they say, "We need Wiesenthal to paint our signs." And he goes back to the camp to his friends. And they left him. His wife had been taken off safely where he knew she would be after the war. He visualized, they would be killed. This is what he says. But always somebody at that hour says, Wiesenthal. Well, wouldn't you shape up after they call your name? So he has these people, no matter who the killer is or what the reason, he goes with them and he lines up. Now, I'll go back next week. I'll continue on the story of Simon Wiesenthal. This is favor number 7 or 8. We can add them up and go on to the next favors and how he's constructed and reconstructed after the war and travels with the Waffen-SS, lives with them. He's the only Jew in a Waffen-SS hospital. He gets double food rations. He is coddled. He is protected. They think that he will keep these lists. He's caught with a list of guards, and he's promoted and helped and saved. I'll continue next week. The hour is up, but I do want to go on the story of Simon Wiesenthal, but there's no time now. So I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell. We'll do part 2 on Wiesenthal next week.